The first time she banged on my gate, I thought it was just another nosy neighbor with too much time and too little purpose. But the way she pounded, 3 sharp hits that made the old wood tremble, it felt like a warning. My dog barked. The wind carried dust across the field, and I knew before I even saw her face that this wasn't a casual visit. This was a storm coming. She stood there in her pressed blazer and pearl necklace, gripping a folder thick with papers like it was a weapon. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "This property," she said, "is now under the jurisdiction of the Homeowners Association." The word jurisdiction rolled off her tongue like she owned the law itself. Behind her the sun burned low, spilling long shadows across my grandfather's 150-year-old ranch, land that had survived droughts, fires, and worse men than her. I didn't argue. Not yet, because deep down I wanted to see just how far she'd go. And she went farther than anyone could have imagined. By the time it was over, there would be police sirens, flashing lights, and a crowd of neighbors recording as she screamed my name like it was a curse. There would be fake officers, forged documents, and a secret she never saw coming, one that would turn her smug smile into raw terror. But back then, in that quiet moment before everything unraveled, I only knew one thing. She had declared war on the wrong person. The land she was trying to take had roots older than her entire neighborhood, and a legacy she couldn't possibly understand. My grandfather used to say, "This ranch doesn't just belong to us. It remembers who stands on it and who trespasses." That day, as she waved her stack of threats and demanded I leave my own home, I realized something chilling. She didn't just want control. She wanted power, and she thought her HOA badge could give it to her. She was wrong, because before the week was over, she'd learned the one truth that shattered her world. The man she tried to evict wasn't just a homeowner. He was the one person she could never control, and when she found out who I really was, would it already be too late? When I first arrived back at my grandfather's ranch, the road leading there felt longer than I remembered. Dust rose behind my truck in a soft golden haze, catching the last streaks of sunlight as the horizon burned orange. The mailbox still leaned at the same tired angle, and the old oak tree by the gate stood wide and proud, its branches like outstretched arms, welcoming me home. The house sat on a rise beyond the fields, weathered but unbroken, white paint peeling in places, the porch sagging slightly in the middle, yet still holding its quiet dignity. Every step toward it felt heavier, not because of the miles, but because of the memories that came flooding back. My grandfather's voice echoed in my mind, as if he were still there on that porch, coffee in hand, telling me stories about the land, how his father carved the first fence posts by hand, how this ranch had survived every storm and every man who tried to claim it. He used to say, "This land doesn't just feed us, it remembers us." That phrase followed me as I walked through the creaking door. Everything inside was the same: the scent of pine soap, the faded photographs on the walls, the rifle mounted above the mantel that hadn't been fired in decades. It felt untouched by time, or maybe just untouched by anyone who cared, but beyond the property line time had moved on fast. The quiet open countryside my grandfather knew was now surrounded by neatly manicured neighborhoods and identical homes that seemed copied from the same catalog. Developers had built them only a few years ago, promising modern country living. What they delivered was an army of gated smiles and endless rules. The new residents didn't understand the land. They tried to tame it. They called the community Oakwood Preserve, a name that sounded peaceful until you realized what it replaced. Real woods, real fields, real history. In their eyes, my ranch was an eyesore, an old scar on their perfect landscape. The HOA president, of course, led that charge. Her name was Karen Whitmore, and she introduced herself the very first week I moved back in. She arrived in a spotless white SUV, stepping out with clipboard in hand and the kind of posture that told you she believed she owned the ground she walked on. Her hair was immaculate, her perfume strong enough to chase off the flies, and her smile practiced. "Welcome back to Oakwood," she said, extending a manicured hand I didn't take. "We're thrilled to have you settling in here. I assume you've read the association guidelines? I told her I wasn't part of any association. My property was older than the HOA itself, older than most of the residents combined. The deed clearly showed that the land was exempt from their jurisdiction. That smile of hers didn't falter, but something flickered behind her eyes. "Oh," she said, just a little too smoothly. "I'm sure that's something we can review together. You'll find it's best if everyone cooperates around here." Cooperates. The word stuck in my mind like a burr. At first, I brushed her off as just another well-meaning control freak. Most communities had at least one. But the way she lingered at the edge of my property, her gaze sweeping over the old barns and broken fences like she was inspecting them for violations, that told me she wasn't just curious. She was measuring something. Over the next few weeks, I learned what cooperation meant in Oakwood Preserve. It meant conformity. Every house had to look identical, the same neutral paint, the same trimmed hedges, even the same brand of mailbox. Lawns were measured with rulers. Garbage bins were fined for being visible after 7 a.m., and at the center of it all was Karen, her voice echoing through neighborhood meetings held in the pristine clubhouse that looked more like a courtroom. She was joined by her loyal board, Tom Avery, the treasurer, a former accountant who believed that fines were the purest form of justice. His glasses were always slightly crooked, but his numbers never were. Diane Peters, the vice president, sweet on the surface, venom underneath. She had the habit of starting every sentence with, "I hate to be the bad guy, but," before doing exactly that. And then there was Rick Morales, the enforcer. He wasn't officially anything in the HOA charter, but he showed up whenever someone needed a reminder. The man wore aviator sunglasses even indoors and loved to mention his security training, which, as I later found out, consisted of being rejected from the police academy twice. Together, they ran the HOA like a miniature regime. Their meetings weren't discussions. They were declarations. Fines were issued like tickets, and dissent was treated like rebellion. At first, they left me alone, maybe because they weren't sure how far their reach extended. But curiosity in a place like this is a dangerous thing. It doesn't stop until it finds something to control. It started small. A letter slipped into my mailbox about unauthorized fencing. The next week, another one arrived, a warning about livestock containment. Then a third, unsightly debris, referring to an old tractor that had been parked in the same spot since before the HOA existed. Ignored them. I figured the best way to handle people like that was to give them no reaction. But that only seemed to provoke them further. The letters became more frequent, more demanding. Then came the visits. First from Rick, then from Diane, each one more invasive than the last. Rick showed up one morning, leaning against his pickup at the edge of my driveway, pretending to admire the view. "You know," he said, "Karen's real particular about boundaries. Likes things clean and proper. She's not a bad person, just wants order." "Order?" I said, watching him through the dust. "Funny, my grandfather used to say order's just another man's excuse to own what isn't his." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just looking out for the community, sir." Community. That word had lost all meaning here. Still, I tried to live quietly. I repaired the old fences, restored the barn, kept mostly to myself. But in a place ruled by control, independence was the ultimate offense. I started noticing the same cars parked just beyond my property line, their windows tinted, engines idling. Drones hovered near the tree line, the faint hum breaking the stillness of early mornings. At the grocery store, people I didn't know greeted me with tight smiles and wary glances. Conversations would stop when I walked by. Someone had been spreading stories that I was hoarding junk, that I refused to pay dues, that I was making threats. It was absurd. But it was working. The HOA didn't just enforce rules, they shaped perception. Once they painted you as a problem, the community believed it. The tension reached a point where even the simplest sounds, the creak of the porch, the bark of my dog, felt heavier, like the calm before a storm. Then came the meeting. Karen invited me personally, or rather, demanded my attendance to clarify my property status. I showed up partly out of curiosity, partly because I wanted to see just how far this web of control stretched. The clubhouse was immaculate, every chair perfectly aligned. A banner on the wall read, "Preserve our community values." The irony wasn't lost on me. Karen sat at the head of the long oak table, surrounded by her board. The air smelled faintly of air freshener and self-importance. She began with pleasantries, all thinly veiled threats. "We've reviewed your case," she said, "and while we understand your attachment to the property, the HOA guidelines require uniformity. Exceptions cause confusion. We can't make special rules for one resident." I reminded her again, calmly, that my land predated the HOA. The county had confirmed it. The board had no legal standing. That smile of hers faltered for the briefest moment, but then she recovered. "Sometimes legalities can be reinterpreted," she said. "And frankly, Governor Walker, your property affects property values in the community." I caught the look in her eyes then. Not frustration, not arrogance, but something darker, obsession. She wasn't fighting for rules. She was fighting for control. When I left that meeting, I noticed Tom scribbling something in his notebook. Diane whispered something to Karen, who nodded slowly. And Rick followed me out to the parking lot, pretending to check his phone. The next day, I found another letter. This one taped to my front door. It wasn't a warning, it was a notice of intent to seize property for non-compliance with community standards. That's when I realized it wasn't about property lines anymore. This was personal. And behind that polite smile, that polished HOA language, there was something hungry, a kind of arrogance that comes from people who believe rules make them untouchable. The neighbors started avoiding eye contact. Some even apologized quietly as they passed by, like they knew something I didn't. The local postman told me one morning that my mail had been temporarily redirected without my permission. Every day felt more like surveillance than community. The old peace of the ranch was gone, replaced by the constant hum of paranoia. But I wasn't afraid, because there was something they didn't know, something my grandfather had made sure of before he passed. He'd always said, "This land's more than ours. It's protected." I used to think he meant spiritually. Now I wasn't so sure. Karen's confidence kept growing, fueled by whispers and false authority. I could see it in her walk, in the way the other board members deferred to her like she was royalty. But in her need for control, she forgot one thing. Power borrowed is power that can be taken away. And the day she marched up to my gate, waving those forged papers and threatening to call the sheriff, I finally understood how far she was willing to go. She thought she was about to make me kneel. She didn't know she was about to kneel herself, because while she was busy plotting my eviction, I'd been preparing for something else entirely. A reckoning this neighborhood would never forget. The land remembers, my grandfather had said, and so would everyone who dared to trespass. The first fine came tucked neatly in an envelope, stamped with the HOA's official seal, a golden oak leaf embossed in green. It was almost beautiful, the kind of stationery you'd expect for a wedding invitation, not an accusation. Inside, the letter read, "Violation 14A, improper aesthetic maintenance. Fine, $250. The offense? My fence. The same hand-built wooden fence my grandfather constructed 50 years ago, the one that had weathered storms and sun and the passing of time. According to Karen and her board, the natural wear of the material clashed with the community's visual harmony. I laughed the first time I read it. It was absurd, a relic of bureaucracy dressed in polite language. I crumpled it and tossed it on the kitchen counter. 2 days later, I received another one, Violation 8C, unauthorized agricultural activity. Fine, $400. Apparently, the 2 goats grazing in the pasture, animals that had been part of this land since before Oakwood Preserve even existed, were livestock, and livestock were not permitted within community limits. By the end of the week, there were 3 more notices, one for noise disturbance, the dog barking at a passing car, one for non-standard mailbox placement, and one for refusal to comply with community uniformity standards. Each letter was colder than the last. Each one signed in the same looping cursive, Karen Whitmore, HOA President. The fines were laughable at first, but they came faster and heavier, like rain turning into hail. Within a month, the total balance had grown into the thousands. The envelopes no longer came by mail. They were hand-delivered, taped to my gate, slipped under my door. One morning, I found Rick Morales sitting in his truck outside, the engine idling, as if waiting to see if I'd tear up the next one, too. I did, right in front of him, he smirked. "Careful," he said, leaning out the window. "Defiance doesn't look good on paper." It wasn't just about paper anymore. They were testing me, seeing how far they could push before I'd bend. The neighbors started to take sides, though none openly at first. Some whispered sympathy when Karen wasn't around. Others avoided me altogether. I saw curtains twitch when I stepped outside. One morning, I caught Mrs. Callahan, the widow from across the cul-de-sac, taking photos of my barn. When she saw me, she smiled nervously and muttered something about community compliance documentation. By then, Karen had begun hosting special sessions at the clubhouse. Every one of them seemed to revolve around property integrity, and though my name wasn't mentioned, everyone knew who she meant. The tone was always the same, subtle fear dressed as concern. "If we let one exception stand," she'd say, her voice syrupy sweet, "where does it end?" The meetings were open to all members of the HOA, except, conveniently, for me. I only found out about them after the fact, when another letter would show up claiming new amendments had passed. The bylaws were multiplying like weeds. Then came the landscaping inspector. He showed up one afternoon in a neon vest and mirrored sunglasses, clipboard in hand, taking measurements of my driveway. "HOA compliance survey," he said curtly when I asked who sent him. His badge was fake. I could see the ink bleeding through the laminated sheet, but he was confident, ticking boxes and snapping photos like he had authority. When I demanded to know who authorized him, he only smiled. "Ms. Whitmore wants to ensure everything meets the new zoning standards," he said. "New standards?" He nodded. "Lot boundaries are being reassessed." That's when I realized what they were trying to do. They weren't just fining me. They were trying to redraw the map. If they could redefine where my land ended, they could absorb it into their jurisdiction. Every letter, every inspection, every whispered rumor, it was part of a strategy. I started documenting everything, photos, recordings, copies of every notice they left. My grandfather had taught me one thing above all else: never fight blind. But they were clever. Karen knew how to twist the narrative. Soon people were whispering that I was unstable, hostile, paranoid. Diane spread the story that I'd threatened Rick when he visited, conveniently forgetting to mention that he'd trespassed onto my porch without invitation. Then came the sprinkler incident. It was early morning when I found 2 HOA maintenance trucks parked by my front fence. 3 men in matching polos were dismantling the irrigation line I'd repaired myself just a week prior. I stepped out, demanding to know who ordered it. One of them shrugged. "HOA maintenance directive. Says your setup violates water distribution policy." "Policy?" I repeated. "This isn't even your property." Rick was there, leaning on one of the trucks, sipping coffee. "You're wasting water runoff into community soil," he said. "We're just fixing it." I told him if he didn't get off my land, I'd call the sheriff. He smiled. "You go right ahead. Sheriff's office already knows who's causing trouble around here." They left after tearing half the line apart. The ground was left a mess of mud and pipe fragments, water pooling in the dirt like open veins. It took me a full day to fix it again. That night, my porch light went out. Not because the bulb burned out, because the wires had been cut. I replaced them the next day and installed cameras, hidden ones. Within a week, I caught Rick returning under the cover of darkness, this time with 2 others. They stayed by the fence, whispering, pointing at the barn. I watched them from the window, recording every second. The next morning, another notice appeared. Violation 19B, unauthorized security equipment, fines, $750, removal required within 48 hours. That one almost made me laugh out loud. They were now fining me for protecting myself from them. I didn't remove the cameras. I added more. The pressure didn't stop there. The HOA sent repair teams to the road leading to my property, claiming the asphalt was under association maintenance. They tore up the edges, blocking my driveway with orange cones and warning signs. For 3 days, I couldn't leave without maneuvering through their barriers. On the 4th day, a tow notice was posted on my truck. I confronted Karen in person. She was standing by the clubhouse fountain, surrounded by her board like a queen holding court. "Every one of those notices is invalid," I told her. "You're harassing me." She didn't flinch. "We're ensuring compliance," she said calmly. "If you don't like the way we do things, perhaps Oakwood Preserve isn't the right fit for you. It's not your land." Her eyes narrowed just slightly. "Maybe not yet." That's when I realized she believed this was a game she could win by persistence alone. And to her, I wasn't a person, I was a precedent. If she could break me, she could control anyone. Over the next month, the situation turned from harassment to siege. Drones flew over the ranch almost nightly now, their soft mechanical buzz constant. One morning, I woke up to find orange paint sprayed across the barn doors. Condemned HOA violation. I called the sheriff's office myself that time. The deputy who arrived was polite but hesitant. "Sir, the HOA says your property falls under their oversight," he told me. "It doesn't," I said firmly. "It's county land, exempt. Check the records." He promised to look into it. Then, 2 days later, I received a notice claiming I had filed false reports and that further misuse of law enforcement resources would result in penalties. The system was folding around her influence. Neighbors began taking part in her crusade, maybe out of fear, maybe out of boredom. Someone started leaving trash on my driveway at night, old furniture, broken lawn ornaments. Another neighbor complained that my porch light was too bright and disrupted the neighborhood aesthetic. It was absurd theater, every act more ridiculous than the last. But it wore on me. Sleep became difficult. I started checking the cameras at 2 a.m., scanning for movement. Even my dog grew anxious, barking at every noise from the road. The emotional toll was heavier than I expected. I'd inherited the land with pride, with purpose. Now it felt like a battlefield. Every fence post, every acre carried the weight of defiance. Then something strange happened. The county assessor's office sent me a letter, not from the HOA this time, but from the official registry. It claimed my property boundaries were under review for community adjustment. Someone had filed a request to annex my land. Only one person could have done that. I drove straight to the county office. The clerk there, a young man named Harris, looked nervous when I mentioned Oakwood Preserve. He flipped through files, hesitating before showing me the application. The name printed at the top was unmistakable. Whitmore, Karen. She had actually filed to absorb my grandfather's ranch into HOA jurisdiction. "She can't do this," I said. He shrugged helplessly. "The process is complicated. If she presents enough resident support and claims shared infrastructure, it can go to review. Shared infrastructure, meaning the road, the water line, anything that could be argued as mutual. They were trying to steal it legally now." When I got home that evening, I found tire tracks near the back pasture and a new sign hammered into the ground. Community Expansion Zone, pending approval. That was the moment the anger truly settled in. Not the sharp kind, but the deep, quiet kind that hardens into resolve. I started gathering everything, every letter, every false fine, every recorded trespass. I compiled it all into a file thick enough to fill a binder. I even found records from my grandfather's time, county exemptions, deeds, handwritten agreements signed by officials decades ago. Proof that the ranch's borders were permanent, but Karen wasn't slowing down. She doubled down instead. She hosted a town review at the clubhouse, inviting every resident to discuss the community's growth. Flyers went out with subtle wording, decisions that affect all of us. When I showed up, the room went silent. Karen smiled like she'd been expecting me. "Ah, Mr. Walker," she said brightly. "Glad you could join us. We were just discussing the proposed boundary integration." "Integration?" I said, scanning the faces. Neighbors, some avoiding my eyes, some looking curious. "You mean annexation," she tilted her head. Such an unfriendly word. She started clicking through a slideshow of proposed improvements, paved roads, new fencing, landscaping upgrades, all funded by community dues. My ranch was plastered in every diagram like a new centerpiece. "You can't just take what doesn't belong to you," I said. Karen's tone shifted, her voice laced with faux pity. "We're not taking, Governor. We're preserving. You could benefit from being part of our community." I saw Tom glance nervously at her, Diane fidgeting with her pen. Even her own board was uneasy, but Karen pressed on, her smile tightening. "Votes scheduled for next month," she said. "Majority rules," the crowd murmured. A few clapped, and I understood why she was trying to turn public opinion before I could act. I left without another word. But my silence wasn't surrender. That night, I went through every county regulation, every legal clause that could protect me. What I found changed everything. Hidden in old archives was a clause, a preservation ordinance passed generations ago. The Walker Ranch wasn't just private land. It was heritage property protected under state law, and I wasn't just its owner. As my grandfather's heir, I was its legal steward, an official title that gave me jurisdiction higher than any HOA board, but I didn't reveal that yet. Instead, I let Karen keep digging her own grave. Over the next few weeks, she grew bolder. She filed noise complaints, landscaping violations, even an accusation that my dog had attacked a neighbor's pet. A lie so obvious that even her board hesitated to back it. But she pushed through, her ego too inflated to see the cracks forming around her. Her allies began to waver. I saw Diane avoiding her calls, Rick keeping his distance. Tom's emails leaked into public record, showing growing doubts about overreach. Still, the harassment continued. I'd wake up to strange cars parked outside. The HOA newsletter began publishing community safety updates, thinly veiled gossip about uncooperative residents endangering property values. It felt endless, but every letter she sent, every threat she made, became more evidence. Then came the day she crossed the final line. I was in the barn when I heard the sound of metal striking wood. A rhythmic pounding. When I stepped outside, there she was again, standing at my gate, pounding her fist against it like she owned the place. Her SUV idled behind her, door open, papers spilling out of a leather folder. "You can't do this," she shouted, voice echoing across the field. "You can't just ignore the law." I walked toward her slowly, the gravel crunching under my boots. "The law," I said quietly. She lifted the papers. More fake notices, more printed threats, her hands shaking with fury. "You've got 5 minutes to leave this property before I call the sheriff. This land is HOA property now." Behind her, the wind picked up, carrying dust and the faint rumble of approaching engines. I recognized the sound before I saw them. Black SUVs rolling fast down the road. She turned, smiling in triumph. "There," she said. "They'll handle this." But something in my gut told me it wasn't the sheriff. I stepped closer to the gate, my voice calm, steady. "Karen," I said, "you have no idea who you're calling." She laughed, sharp, brittle. "You think you can scare me? I am the authority here." The SUVs stopped, men stepping out in uniforms that didn't quite match any department I knew. Their badges were wrong. Their posture too rigid, too rehearsed. It was all falling into place now. The lies, the pressure, the paranoia. She hadn't just crossed a line. She'd invited something dangerous into it. As they started walking toward me, hands near their belts, I slipped my hand into my jacket pocket where my grandfather's old badge rested, its gold glinting faintly in the sun. Karen thought she was summoning law enforcement. She had no idea she was about to meet it. And as the men fanned out across the gravel, her victory smile froze, because the real storm she'd been calling for had just arrived. The sun burned low over the horizon, painting the sky with the same kind of fire that had been building inside me for weeks. The air felt electric, heavy with the kind of silence that comes before a storm. Every step I took across that gravel path crunched like a countdown. The HOA had pushed, prodded, and punished. They had taken their games too far. And tonight, it was all going to break. It started that morning when I found a final notice nailed to my fence. Not taped, not mailed, but hammered through the old wood like a warning. Red letters screamed across the page. Final violation. Immediate eviction. Pending. Beneath it, a signature I knew too well. Karen Whitmore, HOA president. The same woman who had called me a liability to the neighborhood. The same woman who had accused me of diminishing community value because my grandfather's ranch didn't look like her rows of plastic perfection. But this wasn't just another threat. This one had the sheriff's name printed below, forged. They were going to try to make it official. That's when I knew they'd crossed a line they couldn't uncross. By noon, the whole neighborhood was buzzing. Cars slowed as they passed my gate. Whispers rippled through the manicured lawns and freshly painted porches. Some looked at me with pity, others with quiet excitement, the kind people feel when someone else's life is about to implode. Then came the convoy. 3 black SUVs rolled up the dusty road, kicking up clouds that blotted out the sun. My dog barked wildly, sensing what I already knew. This wasn't law enforcement. This was them. Karen climbed out of the lead vehicle like she was stepping onto a stage. Sunglasses, clipboard, that same tight smile she wore when she thought she was winning. Behind her, a handful of men in fake uniforms, patches that looked almost real but not quite. "Step away from the property," she barked, loud enough for the watching neighbors to hear. "This land is now under HOA jurisdiction." Her voice trembled slightly, not from fear but from excitement. She thought this was her moment. I stood in the shadow of the old barn, the wind tossing dust across the field. "You're trespassing," I said evenly. She laughed. "You think you can talk your way out of this? You've ignored citations, fines, and legal warnings. You've left us no choice. The board has voted unanimously to seize control." Behind her, the fake deputies began spreading out, pretending to inspect the property. One reached for the gate latch. That's when I pulled the envelope from my coat, thick, official, and sealed with the state's insignia, the same insignia that gleamed on the badge, resting heavy in my pocket. Karen's confidence faltered. "What is that?" she asked. "The paperwork you should have checked before trying to steal what doesn't belong to you." I handed her the letter. Her hand shook as she tore it open. Her eyes darted across the page, widening with every line. It was a state audit, an investigation into the HOA's finances, triggered by multiple anonymous complaints, embezzlement, forgery, illegal enforcement practices, and at the top of the list, her name. Her voice caught in her throat. You can't. This isn't real." But I wasn't done. I pulled out the badge, the metal flashing under the afternoon light. "It's real enough," I said quietly. "Governor's Office of State Affairs. I don't just live here, Karen. I oversee every legal entity in this county, including yours." Her sunglasses slipped from her face. You're lying." The men behind her stopped moving. One leaned closer, whispering something that made the others stiffen. Their hands fell from their belts. The air thickened with the realization settling in. And then her phone rang. Karen snatched it up like a lifeline. "Yes, I have him right here," she said quickly. "We're about to remove him from the property." Voice interrupted from the speaker, sharp and commanding. "Karen, stop." It was the sheriff. The real one. His tone was ice. "You're not authorized to remove anyone. That land belongs to the Walker family, and you just stepped into criminal territory." The fake deputies looked at each other, panic flashing in their eyes. Karen froze. "Sheriff, wait!" But he wasn't done. "Do you know who you're talking to? That man standing on that property is the governor of this state." The color drained from her face. The clipboard slipped from her hand, hitting the ground with a dull thud. The fake officers scrambled, rushing back to their SUVs. Engines roared to life, tires skidding across the gravel as they tore down the road. Karen stood alone, trembling, phone still clutched in her hand. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. "You've harassed me, forged documents, and tried to take what's mine. You thought no one would notice. You thought you could play queen of this little kingdom." She backed up, eyes darting toward the open field behind her. But I didn't move closer. I didn't have to, because down that same road the SUVs had fled, a new set of vehicles appeared, county cruisers, red and blue lights, slicing through the dust. The real deputies, the real law. Karen's breathing quickened. "This is all a misunderstanding," she stammered, voice cracking. "I was just trying to uphold community standards." The sheriff stepped out of the first cruiser, boots crunching on gravel. He tipped his hat to me before turning to her. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for trespassing, impersonating an officer, and falsifying legal documents." Her eyes went wide. "You can't do this to me. I'm the president of the HOA. I have rights." "Not the kind you think," the sheriff said calmly, as deputies closed in. Karen spun toward me, fury twisting her face. "You set me up. You think you can humiliate me like this? You have no idea who I know." I didn't flinch. "The only name that matters here," I said, "is mine." The cuffs clicked. The watching neighbors fell silent, phones recording every second. For months they'd whispered, judged, stayed out of the fight. Now they were witnesses to its end. As they led her to the cruiser, Karen thrashed, still shouting, "This isn't over! You'll regret this!" But the truth was, it was over. The sheriff turned to me, nodding once. "We'll handle the rest, sir. I'm sorry it came to this." I looked out over the fields, my grandfather's fields, glowing gold in the setting sun. The fence she tried to take now stood like a line drawn in history, unbroken. As the cruisers disappeared down the road, the neighbors began to drift away, murmuring in awe. Some offered quiet apologies, others just stared, and I stood there in the dust, the echo of her threats fading into the hum of the cicadas. The war she started to claim control had ended with her in handcuffs. But even as peace settled in, I knew one thing for sure: this was more than an HOA dispute. It was a reminder. Power built on lies always crumbles. And the louder someone tries to control others, the more fragile their kingdom really is. That night, as the stars rose over the old ranch, I thought about my grandfather's words. Never let anyone take what's yours. Not through force, not through fear. Karen tried both, and now the land was quiet again. My family's legacy, safe. Still, as I closed the gate and looked back one last time, I couldn't help but wonder, how many more Karens were out there, still believing their rules mattered more than the truth? The dust from that day didn't settle quickly. For weeks, the air in the neighborhood carried a strange tension, a mix of shame, disbelief, and quiet awakening. The HOA board that once strutted down the streets like royalty was suddenly silent. Their once proud meetings, the ones filled with smug smiles and whispered gossip, had turned into scenes of chaos and denial. No one wanted to admit they'd followed Karen blindly, but the truth had already clawed its way into the light. The story spread fast, first through the town, then through the county. The videos recorded by neighbors made their way online. The moment the sheriff placed Karen in handcuffs, the shock on her face when she realized who I truly was, the flashing lights reflecting off her HOA badge as she was led away. It became a symbol of poetic justice. People who'd once whispered behind my back now couldn't look me in the eye. Some came to apologize, awkward and trembling, with coffee cups and excuses in hand. Others stayed away, unsure how to face the man they'd watched be harassed for months. I didn't need their words. The silence between us said enough. Within days, state investigators were crawling through the HOA's offices. The files they uncovered painted a picture darker than anyone expected: misused funds, forged citations, manipulated votes, illegal fines funneled into personal accounts. Karen hadn't been running a homeowners association. She'd been running an empire built on fear and money. Every petty warning, every bogus rule, every letter meant to intimidate, it was all a part of her control. And now it was unraveling faster than anyone could stop it. The board members turned on each other almost immediately. The vice president claimed ignorance, saying he just signed whatever she put in front of him. The treasurer tried to flee the state, caught at the airport with a suitcase full of cash. And the secretary, who used to hand out fines with a smile, started singing like a bird the moment the auditors showed up. The HOA was suspended indefinitely pending criminal charges, their bank accounts frozen, their bylaws nullified. For the first time in decades, Oakwood Hollow, a place once run by intimidation, was free. But freedom came with a strange quiet. The first morning after the arrests, I stood on my porch, coffee in hand, listening. No letters on the gate, no anonymous complaints in my mailbox, no cars slowing down to take pictures of my violations. The only sound was the wind moving through the old oak trees, the same ones my grandfather had planted when he built this ranch. For the first time in years, the land felt alive again. And yet, peace never comes without reflection. That night, sitting by the fireplace, I went through my grandfather's old journal, the one he'd kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the barn. He'd written about the same kind of people Karen became, the ones who believed order was the same as control. His words hit harder than ever. Power attracts the ones least suited to handle it, but true ownership, that comes from honor, not fear. I understood now what he meant. Karen never cared about rules or community. She cared about ownership, not of land, but of people. And she wasn't the only one who'd forgotten the difference. Weeks passed. The sheriff stopped by one afternoon with an update. Karen was facing multiple charges: impersonation of an officer, fraud, criminal trespassing, and a conspiracy. The rest of the board would face civil penalties. Her empire had fallen. He also handed me something, the original title deed of the ranch, newly certified and recorded, no longer entangled in the HOA's fraudulent paperwork. My name, clean and undisputed. You've got what's yours again, he said. Your grandfather would have been proud. After he left, I walked the property line, from the rusted gate she once tried to tear down to the old barn that had withstood generations of storms. The land felt heavier somehow, not in burden, but in meaning. As I passed the boundary fence, I noticed movement. A few neighbors standing by the road, hesitating before approaching. It was the Mitchells, the same couple who had once filed a noise complaint because of my tractor at dawn. The husband spoke first, his voice unsure. "We're sorry," he said. "We didn't know what was really happening. She made us believe—" "I know," I interrupted softly. "You all did what you thought you had to." His wife nodded. "We want to make things right." The community's talking about reforming the HOA, real elections this time, transparent, fair. I smiled faintly. Then maybe something good will come of all this. They looked relieved, as if a weight had lifted. For the first time, they weren't talking at me. They were talking to me. Days turned into weeks, and the town changed. Fences that once divided neighbors now served as boundaries of mutual respect. The HOA office, once the epicenter of fear, stood boarded up and abandoned. The new community council, formed under the sheriff's supervision, built not on rules, but on cooperation. They even invited me to the first town meeting. I didn't plan to go, but curiosity won. When I walked in, the room went quiet. Not out of fear, but respect. The new chairperson stood up and said, "Mr. Walker, your story reminded us what happens when power loses its purpose. This community owes you more than an apology. It owes you a future built on fairness." I didn't say much, just nodded. But inside I felt something shift. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like the outsider on my own land. As weeks passed, the ranch came alive again. The fences were mended, the fields replanted, and the barn restored. I found old photographs of my grandfather shaking hands with neighbors. Back when this place was more than property, it was belonging. I started hosting small gatherings at the ranch. Nothing fancy, just coffee, laughter, shared stories. People who had once crossed the street to avoid me now sat on my porch swapping memories. The fear that had once ruled Oakwood Hollow was gone, but not everyone could let go of it so easily. One evening, a letter arrived. No stamp, no return address, just slipped under my gate. Inside was a single line written in a shaky hand. You may have won this time, but the rules always return. No signature. But I knew that handwriting got Karen, whether it was sent from a seller through someone else, I didn't know. But instead of fear, the message made me smile. Because I realized something she never had. Rules don't build communities. People do. I burned the letter in the fireplace that night, watching the paper curl and blacken until only ash remained. Months later, the state announced the official dissolution of the Oakwood Hollow HOA. The land titles were released from their grip. The residents no longer bound by their suffocating bylaws. A new charter